Hi, friends. Welcome to Bar of the Conference. I'm your host, Derek Scott III. Today's episode is with Jason Micheli. Jason is an ordained elder in the Virginia Annual Conference. He's an author and one of the hosts of the podcast, Crackers and Grape Juice. Jason and his wife live in Northern Virginia, where he pastors a local congregation. They have 2 sons and 2 dogs. There's so much that I want to say about this episode. It's so much that I appreciate about Jason, including his humor. But I wanted Jason on the podcast because I've appreciated the way that he thinks about theology and how we live out our faith in light of it. But as we were talking, Jason's willingness to be transparent about his journey and where he finds himself in the big conversations of the UMC, it was those things that were a gift that I was not expecting. I'm thankful that there are pastors in the United Methodist Church like Jason. This was a rich conversation for me personally, and I think you're going to really love it. So you know what to do. Grab that notebook, that choice beverage. Let's listen in to this interview with Jason Micheli. Jason Micheli, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast. How are you doing this morning?
I am great.
Jason, I'm really grateful that you joined me on Bar of the Conference. I sent you like the coldest of cold emails, and I was just like, we're just going to see if like I get a response. And you were gracious to hop on, and I'm just really excited. As a listener of Crackers and Grape Juice, a fan of what you and Tier and Taylor are doing, have been doing, and in some respects even paying attention to that as I've been doing this.
Well, you can't leave out Tommy and Joanna, or they'll be pissed off at me.
Okay,
so.
thank you, because this is why you're here, to help me make sure I name all of the great people at Crackers and Grape Juice. It's a great podcast. If you're not listening to it, get on board, because it's always good. Jason, all I really know about you is that you are a United Methodist pastor in Virginia and that you are one of the hosts of Crackers and Grape Juice. Would love to know more, specifically how you became a United Methodist Christian, God's prevenient grace in your life, bringing you into our church. So any and all of that, we'd love to hear about it.
So you don't know any of that about me?
No, I don't. I mean, I know a little bit. I know, like, I don't know how some of these like bullet points fit into the actual constellation that is.
So I mean, are you really a listener of Crackers and Grape Juice if you don't know?
Well, I know certain things. Again, I know bullet points. I know bullet points. Okay, I have said that this is great.
So I would say, I mean, honestly, the best way to answer that question is that I am a Christian who is now also a pastor. So I'm a Christian who happens to be United Methodist, and I'm a pastor who happens to be United Methodist. And that's a function of the fact that, so I didn't grow up in the church at all, like minus like a shotgun wedding, that my uncle had when I was a kid, where we're like, even as a little kid, I'm like, what are they doing? Why are they getting married? This is a terrible idea. So that was my only exposure to church. And my immigrant Italian grandmother, who had arms like a lineman and a mustache and and a terrifying life-size crucifix above the guest bed where I slept. That was my only religious exposure. And then when I was 16, 17, my mom announced out of the blue one evening, it was Christmas Eve, that we were going to church. And that was like the proverbial record of my life scratching off track. Like does not compute. And so we went that Christmas Eve, and I was, I think because I grew up in a home of addiction and abuse, that had made me cynical to an unhealthy degree. And so I think, going to church was my mom's intervention. So we went that Christmas Eve. I was an asshole about it. And my mom was a nurse, and so she worked every other weekend. And so after that Christmas Eve, we went every other Sunday. And to some extent, like this, so it's part ordinary and it's part mystical. There's an extent to which a few months of required church attendance kind of just took on me. But then I had this encounter where I remember one Sunday I went up for communion, and the person serving me the bread was no longer Steve Chiaka. But was Jesus. And I don't know how that I knew that. I just knew that I knew it. And it scared the shit out of me. But I think maybe I needed to be scared into being a Christian. And so I became a Christian with a convert's zeal, at 17. And then shortly after that, I went to UVA for undergrad. And just on a lark, I signed up for a class called Elements of Christian Thought that was being taught by David Bentley Hart when he was finishing up his PhD. And I didn't really understand anything he was saying. It just made me aware that the Christian tradition is deeper and wider than I had any prior conception of. And I wanted to keep learning more. So it was like this perfect storm of personal, spiritual, mystical experience and kind of intellectual excitement, kind of combining at the same time. And then I had a similar encounter in college, kind of being scared into pursuing ministry by Jesus. So I say I happen to be United Methodist. It's because the church where all that happened was a new church start. And so I don't know that I was even aware that it was a Methodist church really until, I was too far along the track to change horses. And the pastor who was kind of then responsible for mentoring me, he represented a tradition bigger than just our own. I remember the first book he gave me was like Thomas Aquinas, so.
Wow. So you're at UVA, you're sitting under the leadership of David Bentley Hart.
I had great so it was like David Bentley Hart and John Milbank and Eugene Rogers. It was and Judith Kovacs. The religion department at UVA was and Peter Oakes and Vanessa Oakes, two rabbis. It was a wonderful experience. And I met, waiting tables in Charlottesville, I met Julian Hart, who had come from Yale to start the religion department there. And I became fast friends with him and his wife in their final years, and they came to my wedding. And it was just and Julian had taught Stanley Herawas, and so I had this connection to it was just this wonderful place. But yeah, it was homecoming weekend in the fall, and I was doing work in the stacks of Alderman Library, and some stranger, again, and I knew it was Jesus I don't know how I knew that. just out of the blue started talking to me about pursuing ministry, and not needing to do the things, the alternatives that I thought I needed to do. I mean, I like to tell people that I know Jesus is, so I know the resurrection is true because I've met him. That makes mainline Christians like, yeah, I met this uncomfortable, but yeah, I wouldn't be doing this otherwise, because ministry is not at all natural to my disposition.
So you leave UVA and head directly to seminary, or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have no actual real world skills. Can't fix a car. I can fix a decent meal, but yeah, I went straight from undergrad to seminary. I went to Princeton Seminary because they gave me the most money, and that's where my teachers told me to go.
Yeah.
And I didn't have any money, and there was a small clergy killing Methodist church near campus that needed a pastor, and I was one of the few Methodist students at the school, and so I quickly became a part-time pastor of that church at the same time.
And did you feel like Methodism, United Methodism specifically, just fit, or this is just the option that made the most sense? What brought you, what made you say yes to this particular denomination and expression of faith?
Well, so if you have listened to my podcast,
and I know a little bit of what, but there are a lot of people listening to this podcast who have not listened to Crackers and Grape Juice.
Oh, I know. So. Yeah. So
thank you for humoring me.
No. So I mean, if you've listened to me, I'm not a company person. I mean, yeah. In all honesty, so in college, I worshiped at an Episcopal church because there's something about United Methodism, like we don't do university churches very well that I have experienced. And I just went to one recently, and it was not good either. So I tried going to the Methodist church on campus at UVA, and it was dreadful and not at all. It just. So I guess my initial frustration was that I got into this because I thought it was about Jesus, right? And you don't always get that impression from some of our churches. And that was true. That was true in college. So I worshiped in an Episcopal church instead. And so I thought about maybe I'll just switch over. Because I liked the liturgy. And then when I was in school, surrounded by Presbyterians, I fell in love with Karl Barth in college, and then definitely in seminary. And I thought about, I was like, I could be Presbyterian. But it was Julian Hart. It was Julian Hart, the aforementioned Julian Hart, who convinced me that United Methodism was a broad enough tradition to accommodate various expressions. So I stayed, so it's so me and the Methodist Church is more like a marriage that maybe isn't the perfect marriage, but give it time and we learn to love one another. And so yeah, I think, and now I'm at the place too where I think the seldom examined gift that Methodism brings is that on paper at least, we are sacramental evangelicals who care about the poor. That doesn't appear to be the thing that we identify as very often, but I do think historically that's the contribution we have to make.
I'd love to hear that a little bit more.
Okay.
Well,
so
go ahead.
No, so I'm doing this long sermon series through the Book of Revelation. I mostly do Lectio Continua. I find my preaching is better, and people are thinking about the scriptures better if I'm in one book of the Bible at a time. And so I just preached on the letter to the church in Laodicea in Revelation 3. Who are lukewarm Christians, kind of meh on Jesus, and Jesus says, I'm going to projectile vomit you out of my mouth. And it didn't make it into the sermon, but in preparing for that sermon, I reread John Wesley's Almost Christian sermon.
Mm-hmm.
And I was struck again that so much of the stuff we want to identify as Wesleyan, his works of mercy, etc. Those are the things he lists in that sermon as like, no, it's not that. It's not that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that. And so I think, we have a tendency to lift up things and identify them as Wesleyan. And most often they fall into the pre-conversion experience of John Wesley, not the post.
Yeah.
That like, it's like, well, so I mean, if it's Luther's summary of the gospel from Paul in Romans, and with Charles it was Galatians, that like if it's that Reformation message that started the Methodist movement, why is it we hear so little about that in United Methodism? And instead we hear connections made to a different Wesley that comports more with mainline liberal assumptions in America. Liberal theologically, not like in terms of politics.
Yeah. So and now I'll be honest here. It is your way of sort of both articulating all of these different points, but also I feel like every time I've listened to your podcast, you are always like theology forward. Like it just like immediately points to like doctrine of justification. Like it just and I appreciate that. Do you feel at home then in United Methodism?
I think if I'd gone to Duke, I probably would have turned into a Presbyterian.
Yeah.
So I'm contrary by nature. But no, yeah, I am. Mm-hmm.
There's this picture of you on your website of you sitting, I think, doing a children's moment in your congregation. And to me, it gives this image of being really on the ground, like really bringing the presence and word of Christ in a way that like is super accessible. But again, I listened to you on the podcast, and it's just all it's way up here. I mean, just the names you've mentioned. You fell in love with Karl Barth. Like there are folks listening to this is like, are you gonna have Karl on the podcast as well, Derek? Like, so I'm wondering, like, do you feel like you are able to bridge from sort of the deeply theological and I would say philosophical discussions around Christianity and how we think about church to being super accessible on the ground? Do you feel like you're able to bridge that, or is that like just two different functions of what it means to be Jason?
Oh, I don't. I mean, that's probably a question better asked to someone in my church. But I mean, I do. So I learned. Not that, well, I shouldn't name any other names. One of the things I've learned from Robert Jensen, the theologian of blessed memory, is that any person doing theology worth his or her salt needs to be able to distill what they're saying down such that a child could understand the point. And so, I mean, I work at it. I don't think anyone in post-Christian America is served by pastors who are theologically uncurious. I think people need to know that I think people want to know that it's true and that Jesus is real. And part of that encounter is connecting them with a tradition that is big and old and global. Especially like I found with like young people, like even if they don't understand what I'm saying, they need the assurance that whatever questions they're struggling with, generally, almost always, are questions that someone, 1,000 years ago in the church has already chewed on and written about. So I think it's, and that picture you mentioned on the church website, that's just a tradition I started, so the kids do a Christmas pageant, like the second or third Sunday of every Advent. And it's not long enough to be the whole service, so like,
Right.
So but it's a bad Sunday for a sermon because you got to stick something else in the service to make it feel worth people having gotten up and come to church that Sunday. And so after they do the pageant, they all sit down on the stage, and I have this like spinning wheel from like a raffle or whatever, and we just label it 1 through 14 or whatever it is, and the kids have come up with questions about the season of Advent, the Christmas story, and I just answer their questions at random. And so I think part of it is just to take their questions seriously too, and to model kind of a non-anxious presence with people's questions. That's more than you asked for, but I think, and part of it too is like you mentioned justification. Like I had this aha moment reading Jensen, that justification really isn't like a doctrine per se. It's really just a rule of speech. That however Christians speak Christian, we need to speak it in a way that elicits joy and gratitude. That like justification is meant to keep things in the register of good news. And so it's not just doing theology for theology's sake. It's like making sure, how do these different parts fit so that what I'm saying is gospel?
Is this also this desire to not just do theology for theology's sake? Is this why maybe you didn't stay in the academy and become a professor like all of the professors, the theologians that nurtured you?
I mean, I think
not to say that you can't do both, but it does seem to me that you're not trying to speak to the high theology class of mainline Christianity as much as feels like you're trying to speak to a lot of us who are on the ground, needing more grounding.
I mean, theology is for proclamation. It's not for the academy. I I was the TA for the Black preaching class at Princeton.
Okay, again, things I don't know about you. Come on, talk to me about this.
Cleo LaRue took me under his wing, and so I made more money doing that than I did working at the church that I worked at, and it was a great experience. And so he really kind of pushed me to do a PhD in homiletics, but I never really I never really felt that was something I needed or wanted to do, and I've done some teaching here and there, and it's fun to do that just to engage a different set of people, a different set of folks' questions and things like that. So it's a good discipline just to limber up. But other than that, no, I've always thought that, the church doesn't need more pastors leaving for the academy.
You come through seminary, you TA for a Black preaching course. Wow. Okay. You're ordained in the UMC.
Mm-hmm.
And you're an author, and most of our pastors actually tend to at least have one book. Most of our elders tend to at least have one book. But your titles for me are like I'm wondering like how they get past the publisher for some of them. But for one of them at least. But I my sense is that.
Which one are you talking about?
Well, I'm really looking at all three right now, like Acquit Without Any Quo, Living in Sin, and I'm mostly thinking about Cancer is Funny, knowing that it.
It's funny you say that.
But I want to ask a little bit about Cancer is Funny specifically in a moment, but I'm curious about your process of getting to your titles, if that's you getting to your titles or if that's editors getting you there. Like how did you come up with the titles of your books? Because again, they are accessible. Those titles are accessible, and that is, I don't know a lot of Methodist pastor theologians writing books that on the face look like laity can just go grab real quick.
One of the things, so it's like a thing I secretly am proud of is I come up with pretty good sermon titles, after the fact, so like when I post that, I don't have a good title always by Sunday, but after the fact. So, but Cancer is Funny, the title was given to me. So that's like that's the part of publishing that people don't often understand is the author has very little say over the title or cover of the book.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't choose the title. It has offended a number of people. And my wife absolutely loathes the cover. But the other titles I chose. So yeah, I think it's, and this is, it's, I think if anything's Methodist about me, maybe it's that, so like both Luther's Reformation and then the Wesleyan movement, like they're both really primarily preaching renewal movements. And so there's nothing more Wesleyan than just trying to communicate in a way that gets people's attention.
Jason, reading your bio, if I read it correctly, it says you have incurable cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that is connected to Cancer is Funny. Just curious, you can speak a little bit about that and how that is also informing your journey as a follower, as a pastor, and even as a theologian.
So I have something called mantle cell lymphoma. It's a cancer of my bone marrow. And so yeah, it presented in a bad way in 2014. So I had emergency surgery and a year of intense chemotherapy and bone marrow stuff, in which, at the beginning of that, the odds weren't ever in my favor. And so that was so cancer is funny I was on medical leave for a year, and I didn't have much to do other than to write about what I was experiencing. And so the book kind of narrates that year's experience, kind of personally and theologically. It's theological, but it's irreverent and real. So I tried to make it. I didn't want it to be sentimental or have this like veneer of Christianity such that it didn't feel human. I came out of that, and I still do, regular visits and blood work and maintenance chemo and those sorts of things, CT scans and all the rest of it. But I feel fine. It's just something that will never be in remission. And I'm already, it should have already come back by now. So it hasn't, knock on wood. But yeah, so it's every day is Ash Wednesday.
Thanks for your willingness to share that.
Oh, I mean, it's just kind of, part of the deal with me now. And in some ways it makes ministry easier, and in some ways it makes it harder. Because people who know that part of my story, whenever they get sick, they immediately want to minimize their own situation or problems. And I'm like, well, you're dying. You don't need to minimize this. And let's not compare pain, that's not useful. So anyway, it is what it is. And now I'm, it depresses me that now I'm old enough that, if I die, people aren't going to think it's tragic. Like, back then it was like, oh, he was so young.
I want to talk about crackers and grape juice. This podcast, I have appreciated it for so many reasons. I can't remember which episode was first for me, but I find myself listening to the podcast, washing dishes or folding clothes, something, and the dry humor is always like just like disarming. But also I've been grateful for the diversity of guests you've had. I mean,
which is not a comment. A lot of people.
Well, and some of this is what makes me weird in a lot of spaces too. But I mean, you got Trevin Wax,
Mm-hmm.
and then Chris Green,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have these bishops. Bishop Willimon, Bishop Carter, Bishop Harper Johnson, which that's its own sort of spectrum there. But then Brian Zond, and it's not this like right to left. I mean, it is, and I've just mentioned all the dudes, and I apologize. Caitlin Beatty has been on as well. It's this constellation of followers of Jesus. And so I'm just curious, what's the inspiration for you all in the studio, in the editing process, in the decision making of who you're going to reach out to? Like, what's the inspiration for Crackers and Grape Juice, and is there a hope to it? Or, I mean, because there's a sense that these things are just fun and like it's something that you want to do, but is there a larger hope? Are you hoping to speak to a larger conversation? And because I feel like it's doing that, but is that like your intent?
I think this relates to ministry in that, like, so I've always been dubious of like long range planning kind of stuff, because I found that, truly good ideas or callings are there things that just kind of happen.
Yeah. Kind of same.
Yeah. So, and this connects back to the cancer thing. And so, when I was on medical leave, I woke up, I woke up from emergency surgery, and one of the first people that was like sitting next to my bed was Tier Hardy. And that year off of, because I'd been at Aldersgate United Methodist Church for I think like 12 years at that point. We had started a satellite congregation, so I was working at that. So I was working real hard, and I had two little kids, and so I had let my friendships kind of lie fallow as a result. Mm-hmm. And so the podcast is really, it was just hey, if we start a podcast, then I'll be forced to talk with you once a week. So there was no plan behind it other than just wanting to maintain friendships. And so I do the podcast with a group of people now. It's grown in size. So Tier, I married Tier and his wife, and then he was my youth director for a while. Taylor was a high school student when I first came to his church, and now he's a colleague whose sister is married to my brother-in-law. And so Taylor started out listening to the podcast, and he volunteered to edit the podcast, and then he got more involved. Joanna does the podcast with us. She's a professor, not a pastor. I worked summers at a Methodist summer camp with her during college, so I've known her for forever. Tommy is our editor now. She became a friend through a friend. She's the daughter of a friend, and then she became a friend too. And then there's the minion, David King. Doesn't do as much as he should with us, but I've known him since he was 6 years old. And then on Monday nights, we do various book studies and classes, and Todd Littleton and Josh Moneykeisen are like the newest members of the team. They do Monday nights with us. And so we're all just friends. And there's no agenda or plan or ideological goal other than just to get together and talk about, things that matter.
Wow.
And so, I think there's a relative theological and political diversity to the people that we have on, I think. Like you mentioned, Trevin and Chris are from a more traditional wing of the Christian church. And we've had, people like David French on the podcast too, are more conservative politically. And yeah, I mean, I think it's important to, especially like in the climate that is mainline Christianity, it's very easy to draw lines between, progressive and traditionalist and things like that. And so to the extent that I have an agenda, it's that I want to make sure that we are still treating these people like, valid members of the body of Christ. I think Methodists can have their own intramural debates on various issues of inclusion, and I think that's right. But that doesn't change the fact that there's all these other bodies and traditions beyond United Methodism that are good and faithful and different than us.
So, Jason, this podcast is about the stories of United Methodists and the ways that those stories are shaping our church. And I've used this point in our history as a way of kind of trying to get us to talk about where we're headed. And that point is the special session in 2019, where the traditional plan passed. And I was in the room for that. I was on the floor for
I was above you.
You were above me. Gosh, I wish I could have like turned around and be like, Jason, what's happening? We all experienced that moment and that the passage of the traditional plan differently across the connection. And so I've been asking my guests, like, what was that for you when the traditional plan passed? You were in the room, and I imagine it hit you differently than it hit me, but I'm curious for you personally, as a pastor, as a theologian, even, what was your response to the passage of the traditional plan?
I think sadness doesn't seem to capture it very well, but I don't know what other word to use. And it's, and it's a good instance of why you need to separate the church as Jesus's body from the institution called United Methodism. That I thought it was an atrocious confirmation of all of my cynicism. So we were there for the podcast with press passes covering the event. So that was our role. And I just, it was sad to me how, we've created a denomination where the bishops are powerless to lead. So you've got all of them sitting there, but they can't really do anything. And then you have largely two lobbying factions, caucus groups, talking past one another, saying things that we all could have scripted before we came to St. Louis. So none of it was surprising, or very few people, like Jesus was not really invited to the proceeding, so far as I remember. There's a lot of like traditional and progressive law laying. There wasn't a whole lot of gospel being offered, and I just thought it was unfortunate because every church I've served, and I think probably most Methodist churches are, a mix on these issues. And every church I've served, by and large, for LGBTQ people in their congregations, they have the ability to work through this on their own, and to figure out gracious solutions. And this, like the top-down structure of our denomination, takes that ability away from them, and that I find. So I find that frustrating, that the structures of the denomination do not serve the local church. Instead, it seems as though the local church exists to serve them.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
No, it totally makes sense. As a theologian, do you have a take on what's happening to us, and maybe what happened, but the sort of the result of that over the last few years? Is there a theological angle that you use to frame what has happened and what is happening in the United Methodist Church that, for lack of a better way of saying it, just helps it make sense to you?
I think, I don't know that I have an answer. I think we're not the Presbyterian church or the Episcopal church, right? Like, we are attempting to be a global denomination, and that brings challenges, and it brings sometimes cringy optics. It's problematic to see. One of my memories, it's problematic when white folks who look like me from California are telling someone from Africa, like, oh my gosh, like, there's all kinds of colonial overtones to this now, so it's complicated. And I think often, and I think we see this in our politics now too, thanks to your state.
Now.
That, like, in the same way that, like, our politics now, like, it's like people are obsessed with, like, the trans issue, but it feels like we're not really talking about the trans issue. We're just using that as a way of getting at other things. I think similarly, I think in the Methodist Church, the sexuality issue has just become a way to get at a larger theological divide, and it has the unfortunate consequence of scapegoating LGBTQ people. I think we had Emma Green from The Atlantic on the podcast around this time, and I think her insight was really good, that in a internet social media age, we make a mistake in thinking that Wesleyan commitments are what people at something like General Conference hold in common, when in reality, people like Beth Moore and Tim Keller and Rick Warren and Pope Francis, like, there are global Christians with large platforms that on a day-to-day basis do more to shape the Christianity of people who show up at General Conference. And that makes finding consensus all the more difficult.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I answered your question.
You're answering it, and it's leading me to new questions.
So theologically, the way I would put it is that, just to give it like a real reformational distinction, I think as a denomination, we no longer know how to distinguish gospel from law. And I think that's true among traditionalists, and I think it's true among progressives. And what I experienced at General Conference, like I said, was just each side has its own version of law, and it's just laying it down, preaching it to other people, and we don't know. As Fleming Rutledge would say, like, the justification of the ungodly is that is the most inclusive statement the church can make. And we see, and unfortunately, this is an issue that's just thick with appropriate zeal and righteous anger, but also a lot of self-righteousness. I'm happy that it looks like we're getting to a point where we can no longer use this debate as a distraction from other questions of how to be faithful in our current cultural moment.
I want to ask you a question about labels in a second.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious, just based on some things I've heard you say in the last few minutes. Do you, reluctantly or not, identify more as a centrist?
No, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. And that's part of my, I think, sadness at General Conference is like, I don't feel like I belong in either group. So I think that's, and I worry. This is something I do agree with Williman about with this, that like it or not, it's like if we lose all the traditionalists, we also lose the people who most care about Scripture. Like, each of these groups brings different fruit to the church, and we can't just jettison them without thinking we're going to lose something. And also then what blinders do we put on, And so I don't, centrist seems so like namby-pamby. I've always, I already say no to a lot of people who want to get married. Like I don't, and that's part of the incoherence of the debate for me, is that I know for a fact that a whole lot of my colleagues just marry anyone who calls the church wanting to have a wedding, and once you do that, or if you're just baptizing anyone who wants to be baptized, like you've now ceded any right to have an opinion on this issue. You can't, because it's to just the one benchmark you're going to make is someone's sexuality. That's incoherent. And so, so I no, not everyone can get married, and no, not everyone can pursue ordination. That's already true. So what's the issue, and if marriage and ministry are outworkings of baptism, then you can't deny them to someone who's called to them, just based on, unless you're going to stop baptizing infants because they might turn out to be gay one day, And so, so for me, I don't really identify in any of those groups, unfortunately. And so, it's not a very satisfying answer. I'm sorry.
No, it is. If I can follow it up, and we don't necessarily need to keep this in the episode if this doesn't go in a productive direction. Would you identify yourself then as an affirming pastor of queer folk, or a welcoming pastor? What would you say is your relationship with LGBTQ individuals who want to be, who feel a call to clergy orders or to individuals of the same gender who want to be married? What's your response to them?
I am completely uninterested in anything other than whether they're called to those things.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just I mean, I'm disappointed that one of my the best youth minister I ever had went to Yale to pursue ministry, and then dropped out of the UMC when he came out of the closet. And I regret that the church lost someone very good because of that. But at the same time, I've got some very good queer folks in my congregation now who hate this whole issue because they're they don't want to be objectified when they come to church.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
mm-hmm.
that, I don't, in the same way that I don't go through most of my daily life thinking about being a heterosexual, that,
Mm-hmm.
And so they're wearied from having to think about themselves in this way when they come to church. Or having this be the one space where they it's just like right in front of them,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, I think, I don't think, so yes, I think I'm affirming, but I never want to make being affirming the reason for the church's existence. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
That, so it's kind of yeah, you're welcome. Let's move on and follow Jesus. In the same way that, after General Conference, it was hard for me to insist that no, we're not putting a rainbow flag out in front of the church because,
Mm-hmm.
That actually it says some people are welcome. It also says Republicans don't come to church here. That
Mm-hmm.
every symbol draws lines, and the cross should be the only one that we have. Is kind of how I think about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and maybe that's, it's difficult to think about these things in a pietistic tradition like Methodism, where we don't know how to talk about sin,
Mm-hmm.
and if you're constantly talking about holiness, it's easy to think of yourselves as that, and I think that's my biggest frustration. I think on the traditionalist side is that it's the conversation always seems to start from a position of well, we're not sinners, and now let's talk about this thing we've labeled sin, rather than we're all the ungodly. So let's just let's start from a place of mutual condemnation, where the condemnation is God's commandments, not one another. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Oh no, you're making a ton of sense, Jason. I'm hearing you say, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm hearing you say that you long for a way of being church, a way of being possibly even United Methodist, that almost demands that we really keep the table open for everyone. And I heard you say you're not going to put the rainbow flag out because it draws a line and says a certain type of person might not be welcome here, and you're not ready to go there. Though you're ready to receive and affirm one group, you're not ready to let that affirmation close the door on the other group.
If all we're doing as a church is perpetuating the cultural antagonisms that exist in the nation, we're not really following the spirit of Jesus. We're following some other spirit. And I'm less interested in, these are stereotypes, but like I don't want a church where a progressive NPR listening person wants to talk about welcoming, Derek in the abstract, when there is a traditional leaning person sharing the same pew with them that they haven't even bothered to have a conversation with. That like, why don't you start with loving the actual people in your community first, and then working your way out? Because I'm like, and that's like in my own church, like that it was like, there's actual gay people here. Like, you haven't even talked to them about this. Like why don't you start with like where they're at, instead of these like macro conversations. So, I mean, I just, I would like, I think the church needs to be, that was our kind of tagline from General Conference, is, that we're all incompatible with Christian teaching. That's Christian teaching. I mean, that like, if people just fucking read Romans, instead of like, not just Romans 1, but like the whole
thing. Keep reading. Yeah.
That if we just started from a place that, apart from Christ alone, we're all kind of screwed. It's like, I wish it's just, we're not starting from a position of the gospel. And that's my biggest frustration. And so I wish we could start from a place of, well, apart from the grace of God and Jesus Christ, we are all incompatible. And, the law accuses all of us, totally. And so we're all starting from, like, what's that line? I think it's Dave Zoll. Like, all have fallen short of the glory of God, but that doesn't stop us from measuring distances. That I think we need to stop measuring distances and realize we're all equally far out. So I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it totally does. The question I was going to ask you was, do you think these labels, progressive, centrist, traditionalist, are actually helpful or not? I think you already gave me my answer. Yeah, I think particularly the answer is no when your focus is at the local level.
Mm-hmm.
So, from your perspective, how has this latest season of dysfunction harmed the local church, in your opinion, if it has?
Oh yeah, definitely. It was more damaging than COVID, certainly. I had a huge swath of people in my congregation leave the church before I even got back from General Conference. That it was, and by and large, they were people who, they weren't even necessarily aware that this was like an issue in the denomination. And then they're reading about their denomination in the Washington Post, and they're like, "Ugh, I'm not that." And so, and then then for folks who didn't leave, it created an untenable impatience with change. Catholics talk about how the church thinks in centuries. I'm like, but that's not who we are as Americans. And so we had another group of folks, who are more progressive on this, who wanted to change and just are incredibly impatient, and kind of withholding their participation or giving until their preferred version of the church appears. which is just both understandable and unreasonable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then more traditional folks who are just like, why are we even talking about, like this, like, and so it just made things difficult to, I guess it's the most damage it does is that it became a huge distraction when nobody in like we don't have like it's dictated to us from beyond us, and we have very little say in the outcome, and yet it's now kind of the center of the congregation's attention.
Yeah.
So a whole lot of energy spent with both sides feeling kind of powerless.
Yeah. So Jason, we've got another general conference, in parentheses, finally, coming next April, May 2024. I've got a feeling you'll be in the stands.
I hope not. I really hope not. Actually,
really,
yeah. I told the others I didn't want to do it again. But it's going to be in like North Carolina, so it's not even far away. So
let me ask this question: though you don't want to be there, do you have any thoughts on what General Conference 24 needs to be about?
I mean, I think like, how do we allow the church to how do we give the freedom for the church to muddle its way through this with the greatest degree of freedom possible, in a way that doesn't cast aspersions on like the church in Africa. So I think how do we find the flexibility for the most localized expressions of the faith? I mean, I don't know that that's a satisfying. I mean, what I dread is what I dread is, okay, well, we're going to change we come up with a decision to change the discipline, and then we wait another 4 years to figure out how to actualize that, and then and so it's a decade has gone by. I don't get the sense that people in my congregation are going to wait that long, and I think people younger than me won't understand why we're talking about this for that length of time. And so, but I think local, regional flexibility that avoids creating a denomination of like-minded people. Because like that's, I mean, maybe it's an unfair characterization, but like I don't know that you can go into just about any Episcopal church now, and like there's not any real diversity of thought, and that's unfortunate. And so I think there are people that I agree with on this issue, but maybe not for the right reasons, and there are people that I disagree with on this issue, but maybe for different reasons. So it's So I think, how do you welcome the gifts of those whom Jesus calls, without demonizing people who bring different gifts.
Do you have hope for the United Methodist Church?
I have hope for the church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have hope for the church. Yeah, I mean, that was helpful. I mean, I've got, the church I served was a Methodist Episcopal Church, South Church when it started.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then it was the Methodist Episcopal Church, so it's like, the history of this church itself is that these labels come and go. And we got folks buried out in the cemetery who identified with different versions of that. So yeah, I mean, the promise is that hell will not prevail against the church, not the United Methodist Church. And I've got some Jewish friends that I've made through the podcast that are a helpful reminder to me that a smaller scale isn't necessarily a bad thing. That it was always kind of weird to think that everyone in America should be Christian, and also kind of weird to think that United Methodism should just be as big as Amazon or something. So I mean, so who knows what the future will hold.
Jason Micheli, as I've said, I am grateful for the way you think about these things. I'm grateful for the ways that you hold, I can't even say it's intention, you hold together the need to be theologically coherent, but only so that we can serve people well. You're not holding local church and theology in tension. You're saying that they literally have to be the same thing. At least my experience with you is that. So I thank you for being willing to come on this podcast, and you gave me a lot of time today that I'm really grateful for. But I'm really grateful for your thoughts and your witness and your work. So thanks for joining me today, sir.
Absolutely.
We hope you enjoyed the episode. Bar of the Conference is produced by the team at Wesley's Revival, a ministry of Studio Wesley. Subscribe to this show on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or Google platforms so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.